Topic 12. The growth and transformation of Hong Kong in the 20th century. History GPS. The development of Hong Kong in the 20th century. Stepping into the 20th century, Hong Kong was already a world-famous entrepot. Its industry grew and Chinese companies rose in the foreigner-dominated economy. The local Chinese who rose to prominence continued to contribute to Hong Kong. During the Second World War, Hong Kong was occupied by Japan from 1941 to 1945 and underwent recession. After the war, it developed rapidly in various aspects and grew into a modernized city. In 1997, it returned to the motherland. Topic inquiry. What factors promoted the modernization of Hong Kong in the 20th century? 1. Hong Kong before the Second World War. Before the Second World War, Hong Kong's industries were already flourishing. This laid the foundation for its development into an industrial center later on. At the same time, the influence of local Chinese continued to increase. They played an increasingly important role in promoting the developments of Hong Kong under British rule. 2. Hong Kong under Japanese occupation. In 1939, Second World War started. In 1941, Japan invaded and quickly occupied Hong Kong. It then ruled Hong Kong high-handedly. People lived in extreme hardship. The population dropped sharply. Hong Kong was eventually liberated when Japan surrendered to the Allied powers in 1945. 3. Growth and transformation of post-war Hong Kong. Hong Kong quickly developed into an industrial center after the war. In the 1980s, it transformed into an international financial center. In response to the various needs of the growing city, the government implemented housing and education policies, as well as political reforms. Hong Kong kept progressing and transforming. In the late 20th century, British rule ended and Hong Kong returned to the motherland. Look at the timeline of events. Chow Shusong became the first Chinese unofficial member of the Executive Council, 1926. Chinese began to participate in government decision-making. The Japanese occupation of Hong Kong began, 1941. Economic activities stagnated and people's livelihood became difficult. Signing of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, 1947. Provided an opportunity for Hong Kong to develop into an industrial center. Introduction of free and compulsory primary education, 1971, and the 10-year housing program, 1972, helped increase school enrollment rate for school-age children, a milestone in the development of Hong Kong public housing. Establishment of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, 1997, end of British rule in Hong Kong. History starter. 1. The economic prosperity of Hong Kong is achieved by our ancestors. They overcame many difficulties in the last century. The story of Uncle Man is an example. 2. During the 1930s, Hong Kong's entrepot trade prospered. Many people engaged in related work. Uncle Man's father saw that manufacturing industry was in its starting stage. He set up a garment factory. 3. During the Japanese occupation, many factories, including the one that belonged to Uncle Man's father, were shut down. Hong Kong people lived a hard life at the time. 4. During the Chinese Civil War from 1946 to 1949, many mainland Chinese moved to Hong Kong. They brought capital, expertise, and labor to the local manufacturing industry. Uncle Man got a job in garment factory. 5. In the 1950s and 1960s, Hong Kong's manufacturing industry was flourishing. It became the economic pillar of Hong Kong. Uncle Man re-established his father's garment factory. 6. By the 1970s, rent and wages had greatly increased in Hong Kong. Following China's policy of reform and opening up in 1978, Uncle Man relocated his factory to the Pearl River Delta region to lower production costs. 7. From the 1980s, Hong Kong's manufacturing industry was not as flourishing as before. Hong Kong gradually developed into an international financial center. Many foreign investors did business and invested in Hong Kong. 8. Uncle Man sought cooperation from foreign clothing brands to continue his family business. His perseverance was a demonstration of the Lion Rock spirit. This spirit has helped Hong Kong overcome the problems with its economic transformation several times. A. Hong Kong before the Second World War. Guiding questions. What types of industries were there in pre-war Hong Kong and how did they develop? What roles did local Chinese play in political, economical, and social aspects in the pre-war Hong Kong? 1. Pre-Second World War economic development. Under the free port policy, Hong Kong developed into an entrepot. By 1941, entrepot trade was still the major pillar of the economy. Local industry were also flourishing with growing importance. See Topic 8. A. Development of entrepot trade. From 90s to 1910s. Owing to the improvement of transport facilities, Hong Kong's entrepot trade grew steadily. 1920s. Two large-scale strikes badly hit Hong Kong's shipping industry and entrepot trade. The entrepot trade quickly recovered in the late 1920s, soon after the strikes. Early 1930s. The Great Depression in 1929 caused a sharp drop in international trade. Hong Kong's entrepot trade was again hit badly. Late 1930s. Between 1937 and 1940, large parts of China were occupied by Japan. Hong Kong then became China's only gateway for importing and exporting goods. As a result, Hong Kong's entrepot trade greatly increased. Look at the source 12.1. A Kowloon Canton railway station in the 1910s, left, and the Shenzhen section below. The Kowloon Canton Railway greatly facilitated the transportation between Hong Kong and the mainland. History in depth. Strikes in Hong Kong in the 1920s. In January 1922, the seamen's strike broke out in Hong Kong. Local Chinese seamen called for a pay rise but were rejected by the British employers. As a result, a large number of Chinese seamen went on strike. This paralyzed Hong Kong's entrepot trade. Finally, the government and the shipping companies agreed to meet the seamen's demands. The strike ended in early March. In June 1925, the Guangzhou-Hong Kong strike come boycott broke out in Hong Kong. The strike lasted nearly 1 year, paralyzing Hong Kong's trade. Other industries, including banking and insurance, were also affected. It was a critical period for Hong Kong's economy in the 1920s. Look at the source 12.2. A statue commemorating the strikers in the Guangzhou-Hong Kong strike come boycott, above, located in the Haizhou district of Guangzhou, and dockers in the 1920s, below. B. Development of industries. 1. Favorable factors of industrial development. Population growth. Hong Kong had a more stable political environment and more economic opportunities. It attracted many mainland Chinese to settle here. They provided manpower and increased the local demand for daily necessities. All this stimulated the early development of Hong Kong's light industries. Tariff concessions. According to the Ottawa Agreement in 1932, Hong Kong could export its products to the British Commonwealth countries at low price. It promoted the development of local industry. Japanese invasion of China. In 1937, Japan began its full-scale invasion of China. More mainland industrialists and capitalists fled to Hong Kong. They brought capital and expertise to local industries. 2. Features and overview. Stepping into the 1920s, Hong Kong's industry underwent rapid development. It was reflected in the following aspects. Growth of light industries. Foreign and Chinese companies invested in new industries such as rubber products and stationery. Light industries became increasingly prosperous. Rapid increase in number of factories. The number of factories increased rapidly. For example, there were only a few textile factories in the early 20th century. In 1931, there were over 400 textile factories. Rise of Chinese factories. Chinese factories accumulated more capital in the late 19th century. In the 1920s, most of them were of small or medium scale. However, a few already had more capital than foreign factories and broke their dominance in Hong Kong's industrial development. Increased use of machinery in production. Chinese factories started to follow foreign factories and introduced machines in production. The domestic system was replaced. History Extra. Two Girls, famous brand name of Hong Kong. Stepping into the 20th century, Hong Kong people started to come into contact with Western cosmetics. In 1898, Guangzhou businessman Fung Kuntian founded the first cosmetics company, Guangsang Hong, in Hong Kong. All the products had Two Girls as the trademark. Since then, Two Girls had been a popular brand. It became one of the few century-old industrial brand names of Hong Kong. By 1940, Guangsang Hong had already invested 1.2 million Hong Kong dollars, which was a large amount at the time. Look at the source 12.3. In a dream, two girls in traditional Chinese clothing told Fung Kuntian that his new cosmetics business in Hong Kong would be very good. Hence, he named his products Two Girls. 3. Types of industries foreign companies mainly engaged in. Foreign companies had more advanced technology and larger capital. It allowed them to set up bigger factories and machines. They were therefore particularly active in the heavy industries which required high inputs. Shipbuilding industry. The shipbuilding industry was Hong Kong's most important heavy industry in the pre-war period. Owing to the supremacy of technology and capital, foreign companies were able to maintain the leading position in Hong Kong's shipbuilding industry. Manufacturing industry. Foreign companies engaged in the production of daily necessities and food. They even monopolized a few manufacturing sectors in the early 20th century, such as Western medicine, cement, and rope. Green Island Cement Company and Hong Kong Rope Manufacturing Company were examples. Look at the source 12.4. A ferry manufactured by Taikoo Dockyard and Engineering Company in the early 20th century. Look at the source 12.5. In the early 20th century, the plant of Green Island Cement moved from Macau to Hong Kong. Since then, its cement product has been a famous brand of Hong Kong. Photos of Green Island Cement's plant in Hong Kong in the early 20th century left, and its present-day plant in Tuen Mun, below. 4. Types of industries Chinese companies mainly engaged in. Chinese companies were more active in light industries. They contributed particularly to the development of daily necessities and food manufacturing. Textile industry. In 1904, Hong Kong's first Chinese textile factory, the Chinese Foreign Knitting Company of China, was established. Later, more fabric and textile factories were founded. During the period of the Japanese invasion of China, the demand for military uniforms from the mainland further boosted Hong Kong's textile production. Food manufacturing industry. Chinese companies manufactured various foods, seasonings, and beverages, etc. Some of them have become well-known brands in Hong Kong. For example, the Garden Company Limited started to make bread and biscuits as early as 1926. Amoy Food Limited manufactured soy sauce and canned foods since 1928. Vitasoy International Holdings Limited, launched in 1940, provided cheap soy milk drinks in Hong Kong. Look at the source 12.6. The Garden Center in Sham Shui Po, built in 1935, was the tallest building in the district at the time. The clock tower of the building has also become a landmark. Garment industry. In the 1930s, specialized garment factories including Guang Hing Tai Company and Guokman Underwear Company were founded. These factories mainly produced vests, underwear, and socks. Some products were even exported to overseas markets. C. Development of department stores retailing. In 1900s, Hong Kong's first Chinese department store, Sincere Department Store, opened in Central. It was also the first to introduce the fixed-price mode of sale and employ saleswomen. Other department stores, namely Wing On, The Sun, and China Emporium, were established successively. They provided Hong Kong people with a wide range of foreign and local goods. Look at the source 12.7. Advertisement of Guan Hing Tai Garment Factory. Look at the source 12.8. Chinese department stores in Hong Kong in the early 20th century, above, and the Sincere Department Store in Central in the 1910s, below, in red circle. 2. Rise of local Chinese and their roles in pre-Second World War Hong Kong. From the late 19th century onwards, some Chinese elites and leaders emerged in Hong Kong. They became a new class and played a key role in political, economic, and social aspects. A. Political aspect. Serving as a bridge of communication. Stepping into the 20th century, more Chinese elites were appointed as unofficial members of the Legislative Council. Hou Kai and Wei Yuk were even appointed as senior unofficial members. In 1926, Zhou Shusong was appointed as the first Chinese unofficial member of the Executive Council. This marked the start of Chinese participation in policymaking. These Chinese unofficial members served as a bridge of communication between the government and the people. They reflected the views of local Chinese. This helped the government formulate proper policies. History Extra. Hou Kai and the airport. Hou Kai was a famous Chinese elite. He is also well known for founding the Kai Tak Airport. In fact, it is a beautiful misunderstanding. In 1910s, Hou Kai and merchant Au Tak jointly invested in the reclamation of Kowloon Bay. They named the newly reclaimed land Kai Tak Bund. Later, the government purchased the land and built Hong Kong's first civilian airport. It was named Kai Tak Airport and operated until 1998. It can be said that Hou's investment in Kai Tak area laid the foundation for the development of Hong Kong's aviation industry. Look at the source 12.9. A plane preparing to land at the Kai Tak Airport. As the airport was located in the urban area, it was difficult for planes to land and take off, making it one of the world's most dangerous airports. B. Economic aspect. Providing banking services. In the early 20th century, foreign banks did not serve most of the local Chinese. Since 1910s, some wealthy Chinese established banks to serve them. After the Japanese invasion of China in the 1930s, Chinese banks in the mainland also opened branches in Hong Kong. These Chinese banks grew rapidly. They absorbed the deposits of Chinese and provided services such as foreign currency transactions. They broke the monopoly of foreign banks in the banking industry. Among them, the Bank of East Asia was Hong Kong's first Chinese bank listed in the stock market. Look at the source 12.10. A branch of the Bank of East Asia in Yau Ma Tei in 1924. From the source. Study the source 12.11. Compare the scale of Chinese and foreign banks in Hong Kong in 1926. Source 12.11. Capital of some banks in Hong Kong in 1926, left, and Chinese banks established between the 1910s and 1912s, below. C. Social aspect. Promoting steady development. In the pre-Second World War period, Chinese social organizations already provided services to local Chinese. Some also served specific communities. They greatly contributed to the welfare of local Chinese and social stability. 1. Tang Hua Group of Hospitals. In addition to Tang Hua Hospital, some Chinese leaders established Guang Hua Hospital and Tang Hua Eastern Hospital in 1911 and 1929 respectively. In 1931, the hospitals merged from Tang Hua Group of Hospitals. It worked to provide different kinds of services to local Chinese and helped to improve their living standards in various ways. 2. Hwang Yi-kuk. After the new territories came under British rule, local villagers frequently clashed with the government over policies on the new territories. In 1926, village representatives of the new territories formed a statutory advisory body, the Hwang Yi-kuk. It handled ordinary civil cases in the new territories. It also assisted the government in resolving and arbitrating village disputes. Look at the source 12.12. A monument for the old Tung Hua Smallpox Hospital in Kennedy Town. It was one of the key facilities of the Tung Hua Hospital, dedicated to the treatment of smallpox using traditional Chinese methods. Look at the source 12.13. Hwang Yi-kuk Building in Sha Tin, the New Territories. Hwang Yi-kuk worked to protect and promote the interests of local villagers. Through negotiation with the government, it resolved the differences between government and the villagers over affairs concerning the new territories. Thus, it helped promote harmony in the new territories. 3. Clansmen associations. In the 1930s, migrants from the mainland already founded 36 Klansmen associations in Hong Kong. They worked to help migrants adapt to life in Hong Kong. For example, they provided members with money assistance and job referral services. They also held gatherings to give spiritual support to members. These helped stabilize Hong Kong society. Some Klansmen associations also organized Klansmen business associations, such as the General Chamber of Commerce and Industry of the Tong Kun District. They contributed to the development of industry and commerce of Hong Kong. 4. Kai Phong associations. A number of Kai Phong associations had emerged in pre-war Hong Kong. They served the residents of specific neighborhoods and promoted a spirit of mutual help. However, they were only supported and recognized by the government after the Second World War. Look at the source 12.14. In 1873, the residents of 3 villagers of Hong Hom built a Kwong Yam temple in Hong Hom below. In 1902, they set up a public office which became the Hong Hom 3 Districts Kai Phong Association, above. B. Hong Kong during the Japanese occupation, from 1941 to 1945. Guiding question. What were the changes in livelihood under the Japanese occupation? 1. Course of Japanese invasion of Hong Kong. On December 8, 1941, Asian time, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor and Hong Kong at the same time. On December 25, Hong Kong fell to Japan. The Japanese occupation of Hong Kong began and lasted for 3 years and 8 months. Look at the source 12.15. Course of Japanese invasion of Hong Kong, above, and the Japanese troops entering Hong Kong. 1. 8th December. Japanese troops crossed the Shenzhen River to attack Hong Kong. 2. 13th December. Japanese troops captured Kowloon and the last British troops retreated to Hong Kong Island. 3. 18th to 25th December. Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong Island. 4. 25th December. Christopher Mulby, commander of British troops in Hong Kong, second from the left, in front of the table, negotiated a ceasefire with the Japanese army at the Peninsula Hotel. The British troops then surrendered to the Japanese army. 2. Life under Japanese occupation. During the Japanese occupation, the oppressive rule of the Japanese made Hong Kong's people's life extremely miserable. Economic and social development came to a standstill. A. Politics and administration. 1. Establishment of a military government. The Japanese set up a temporary military government at first. In February 1942, the occupation government with Rensuke Isogai as governor was set up. Under the governor were different departments. All important offices were taken up by the Japanese. 2. Adoption of district administration. The occupation government divided Hong Kong into 3 administrative regions. They were further subdivided into 28 districts and each had its district bureau. The adoption of district administration was to tighten control over Hong Kong and the Chinese. Look at the source 12.16. Rensuke Isugai at the headquarters building of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation in Central. The building became the headquarters of the occupation government. Look at the source 12.17. The administrative regions of Hong Kong during the Japanese occupation. Hong Kong Island, Kowloon Peninsula, and the new territories became 3 administrative regions which were further divided into 28 districts. 3. Policy of using the Chinese to control the Chinese. The Chinese formed the majority of Hong Kong's population. Therefore, the occupation government adopted the policy of using the Chinese to control the Chinese. It appointed local Chinese elites as members of 2 Chinese consultative councils or as chiefs of district bureaus. These measures aimed to reduce the anti-Japanese feeling of local Chinese and facilitate governance. B. Economic conditions. 1. Serious inflation. To get resources to support the war, the Japanese issued military notes after taking over Hong Kong. From June 1943, Hong Kong people could only use military notes as official currency. However, the notes devalued quickly, leading to serious inflation. 2. Second, commerce and industry. The Japanese controlled trade and business. Chinese and foreign merchants had to apply to the occupation government if they wanted to set up a business. Though Chinese factories and shops could reopen in 1942, many soon closed down due to the shortage of raw materials. Look at the source 12.18. Wan Chai during the Japanese occupation. Most shops at the time were closed down. History in depth. Military notes. Issue of Japanese military notes. The Japanese government started issuing the military notes during the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. As the notes were not issued by the National Bank, they could not be exchanged into official currency. To control the economy of its occupied territories, the Japanese government used military notes as the sole currency in circulation in these regions. Hong Kong people were also forced to change all their savings into military notes. Value of Japanese military notes after the war. After Britain re-established control over Hong Kong dollar became the official currency again. However, Hong Kong people could not exchange their military notes for Hong Kong dollar. The Japanese government also refused to redeem the military notes issued. It stated that the post-war treaties had already solved the problem of war reparations. The military notes then became worthless. Hong Kong residents' claim on military notes. Nowadays, there are still several private organizations in Hong Kong seeking military notes compensation. The most well-known is Hong Kong Reparation Association. However, the Japanese government has refused the demand. It is likely that the problem of military notes compensation will stay for an indefinite time. Look at the source 12.19. Hong Kong Reparation Association protesting against Japan's refusal to redeem the military notes. C. Social and cultural conditions. 1. Shortage of food. Due to the shortage of food, the occupation government introduced food rationing between 1942 and 1944. People had to get food buying tickets from the district bureaus every month. Each ticket only allowed a person to buy a small amount of rice, salt, oil, and flour every day. Payment was made by military notes. Yet the measure was unable to tackle food shortage. Many people died of starvation. Food rationed per person. 12 taels of oil monthly, 6.4 taels of rice daily, 4 taels of white sugar and 4 taels of brown sugar monthly, 5 boxes of matches monthly, half a caddy of salt monthly. 2. Drastic decrease in population. To solve the problem of food shortage, the occupation government introduced the policy of forced repatriation. Local Chinese were forced to return to the mainland. Some were sent to work in other occupied territories. Hong Kong's population dropped from about 1.6 million in 1941 to about 0.6 million in 1945. Look at the source 12.20. A food rationing office and a rice buying ticket during the Japanese occupation. Look at the source 12.21. From January 1942, the occupation government provided free train and ferry services monthly for local Chinese who wanted to return to the mainland. Later, returning to the mainland became compulsory. As comics say, food rationing during the Japanese occupation. Main point of the comics. How did people live under food rationing? Why did food rationing fail? 1. The occupation government strictly controlled the distribution of resources. However, its management was poor. Food rationing even caused serious inflation. People lived a hard life. 2. In addition, plentiful food was allocated to the army. Food supply dropped and food rations reduced gradually. 3. As the Japanese occupation continued, the rationing system collapsed. People starved because of food shortages. 4. Some people took the risk of buying food on the black market, but the price was extremely high. 5. In order to survive, they could only sell the property and even dismantle furniture for food or money. 6. In 1944, food rationing was officially abolished. Food shortages got worse. People ate bark and peanut meal to fill the empty stomach. Malnutrition was common. 3. Japanized life and education. To strengthen its rule, the occupation government enforced Japanization in Hong Kong. For example, Japanese replaced English as the official language. Western-style buildings were reconstructed in Japanese style. Streets, districts, and buildings were given Japanese names. Mass media had to spread pro-Japanese messages as well. Besides, teachers in schools were forced to take Japanese language examination and training. Students must study Japanese language and culture. They had to salute the Japanese flag and sing the Japanese national anthem. Look at the source 12.22. Textbooks during the Japanese occupation. History Extra. Different life during the Japanese occupation. During the Japanese occupation, Hong Kong people had to accept Japanese culture. They used Showa-era name in counting dates and times and celebrated the Japanese emperor's birthday. Cinemas mainly showed Japanese movies which praised Japanese culture or militarism. Japanese elements could also be found in horse racing. It became an activity that was limited to the Japanese. As horses were used for war, races were run with wooden horses by 1944. Look at the source 12.23. The lottery ticket showed that Showa was used at the time and the dividend was paid by military notes. 3. End of Japanese occupation. In August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. On August 15, Japan finally surrendered. The Japanese occupation of Hong Kong also ended. Britain restored its rule over Hong Kong and Mark Young returned as the governor in May 1946. Data-based question 1. Aim: to understand the life of Hong Kong people during the Japanese occupation. Level 3. Interpreting sources and using own knowledge and understanding. Study the source below and answer the questions that follow. Source: oral history told by Hong Kong people who lived during the Japanese occupation. Fear and hunger are the memories of the older generation of Hong Kong people who lived during the Japanese occupation. Saluting the Japanese army was a thing that all Hong Kong people had to learn. Whenever the soldiers were not happy, they would punish people by slapping them in the face or beating them up. Some people were even stabbed to death on the grounds of violation and resistance. In times of war, food and materials were extremely scarce. Many people ate soybean dregs, peanut meal, and tree roots. These foods were difficult to digest and had poor nutritional value. People died of starvation every day. Some even heard of people eating dead bodies. To solve the problem of food shortage, the Japanese army forced local Chinese to return to the mainland. C. Transformation of Hong Kong after the Second World War. Guiding questions. How did internal and external factors facilitate the post-Second World War development of Hong Kong? What were the developments in politics, economy, society, and livelihood in post-Second World War Hong Kong? 1. Introduction. A. Reconstruction after the war. After the restoration of British rule, the Hong Kong government carried out measures to reconstruct the economy and livelihood. By 1947, Hong Kong's population had increased to over 1.7 million. Social and economic conditions became stable. B. Transformation of Hong Kong into a modern city. Since the 1950s, Hong Kong's economic strength continued to grow. Meanwhile, the government paid attention to maintaining social stability and economic prosperity. It carried out reforms in housing, education, livelihood, and political institutions. All these helped transform Hong Kong into a modern city. History in depth. Britain restored its rule over Hong Kong. On August 30, 1945, Britain restored its rule over Hong Kong, and the day was designated Liberation Day. Meanwhile, Britain was under pressure from the international community to return Hong Kong to China. However, it refused to do so as Hong Kong was a trade, financial, and transportation center in Asia. In addition, China was unable to deal with Britain due to the outbreak of civil war. Hong Kong therefore remained under British control after the Second World War. 2. Economic development. A. Favorable factors for economic development. 1. External factors. Favorable international circumstances bringing investment and opportunities. Relocation of production. In the 1950s, Western countries shifted their labor-intensive industries to other regions where the production cost was lower. Hong Kong's cheap labor and geographical advantage attracted foreign industrialists. Opening of markets. In 1947, many countries signed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, agreeing to reduce tariffs on industrial goods. It provided a great opportunity for Hong Kong products to enter the world market. 2. External factors. China bringing resources and opportunities. Labor force and capital. The Chinese Civil War from 1946 to 1949 broke out after the Second World War. China also faced serious economic hardship and famines in the late 1950s. Many mainland Chinese fled to Hong Kong. They brought with them capital, expertise, skills, and manpower. Look at the source 12.24. Table of large textile and dyeing factories in Hong Kong during the period of 1940s to 1950s. Reform and opening up. In the late 1970s, Hong Kong's industrial development faced the challenges of increasing costs and keen market competition. In 1978, China adopted the policy of reform and opening up. It introduced various measures to attract foreign investment. Hong Kong industrialists then moved their production line to the mainland and invested there. The mainland's opening up also helped revive Hong Kong's entrepot trade. In addition, mainland enterprises chose to invest in Hong Kong. This favored the development of the local financial industry and helped transform Hong Kong into an international financial center in the 1980s. 3. Internal factors. Hong Kong's own strength. Favorable geographical location. Hong Kong is located on the southeast coast in China, bordering the mainland. Foreign investors used it as a springboard for investing in mainland. Hong Kong is also located at the center of the Asia-Pacific region, making it the regional transport and trade hub. In addition, Hong Kong's time zone facilitated international stock trading. Look at the source 12.25. An assembly factory in the mainland. In the early stage of the reform and opening up, many Hong Kong manufacturers built factories in the mainland. They moved part of or even whole assembly processes there to save costs. Stable political environment. After 1945, decolonization movements in Southeast Asia countries, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, and the Vietnam War from 1957 to 1975 broke out. Compared to the political instability in those regions, Hong Kong was relatively stable and more attractive to foreign investment. Pre-Second World War industrial foundation. Before the Second World War, Hong Kong's industry already experienced decades of development. The factories were of certain scale, had certain technology, and a certain size of overseas markets. This enabled post-war Hong Kong's industry to recover quickly and to develop into an industrial center in the 1950s. Excellent trading network and infrastructure. By the 1950s, Hong Kong had been an international entrepot for over a century. It had a worldwide trade network. Besides, facilities like piers, warehouses, railways, and airports had been developed and were being improved. They facilitated business dealings and cargo transportation. Favorable government policies. The Hong Kong government adopted a positive non-intervention policy. This helped maintain Hong Kong's free economy. Besides, Hong Kong had a simple, low-rate tax system. The absence of foreign exchange control also encouraged industrial and financial activities to take place. Look at the source 12.26. Built in the 1970s, the Kwai Tsing Container Terminals is a major logistics center in Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta. It was the world's busiest container port between 1992 and 1999. B. Overview of the economic development. 1. From an entrepot to an industrial center from 1950s to 1970s. Background. China adopted a closed-door policy since 1949. Re-exports from Hong Kong to China sharply decreased. During the Korean War, the United Nations imposed a trade embargo on China. Hong Kong's entrepot trade further declined. It then accelerated the development of light industry to save its economy. Development of labor-intensive industry. From the 1950s to 1960s, labor-intensive industries such as textile and plastics were the main industries. They required less machinery and capital and mainly relied on labor in production. Development of technology-intensive industry. In the 1970s, advanced technology was introduced to increase production efficiency and promote diverse development. Technology-intensive industries such as electronics, toys, and watches emerged. Hong Kong's industrial production changed from labor-intensive to technology-intensive. 2. From an industrial center to an international financial center, from 1970s to the present. Background. Since the 1970s, Hong Kong's manufacturing industry had gradually declined due to the increasing costs and competition from neighboring regions. Meanwhile, Hong Kong had good policies and a good legal system, and it lies in a time zone between those of London and New York. All this facilitated the development of Hong Kong's financial industry. Look at the source 12.27. Products of Hong Kong manufacturing industries, 1950s to 1970s. From the source. Study source 12.27. Identify which industrial goods were labor-intensive and which were technology-intensive. Look at the source 12.28. Transaction hours of the three major financial centers, New York, London, and Hong Kong. They are located in different continents and time zones. New York transaction hours. Winter time. Hong Kong time, 10:30 p.m. to 5 a.m. Summertime, Hong Kong time, 9:30 p.m. to 4 a.m. London transaction hours. Winter time, Hong Kong time, 4 p.m. to midnight. Summertime, Hong Kong time, from 3 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. Hong Kong transaction hours. Hong Kong time, 9:30 a.m., 4 p.m. Development of the financial and other related industries. In the 1980s, Hong Kong developed into an international financial center comparable to New York, London, and Tokyo. The financial, insurance, and real estate industries developed rapidly. They became the pillars of the economy. Hong Kong established a modern banking system. It attracted many international institutions to set up their headquarters and branches in Hong Kong. Hong Kong also had a well-developed stock market and foreign exchange market. Both local and overseas companies actively applied for listing in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was among the world's top ranked in terms of foreign exchange market turnover. Look at the source 12.29. The skyline of Victoria Harbour. The tallest international finance center is also a famous landmark that shows Hong Kong's position as an international financial center. Data-based question 2. Aim: to understand the economic transformation of Hong Kong in the 1950s and 1960s. Level 3. Interpreting sources and using our knowledge and understanding. Study the sources below and answer the questions that follow. Source A. An excerpt from a speech of Hong Kong official in 1953. Over the past 2 years, the value of Hong Kong's foreign trade continued to decrease. The decrease in entrepot trade between Hong Kong and the mainland is the most serious. The value of trade decreased from 240 million Hong Kong dollars in 1951 to 130 Hong Kong million dollars in 1952, dropping as much as 45%. The economy of Hong Kong is facing the toughest challenge since its opening. Source B. An excerpt from an article about the development of Hong Kong's manufacturing industry between the 1950s and 1960s. Hong Kong's manufacturing industry developed rapidly in the 1950s to 1960s. At the time, the products were well known for being cheap but excellent. They were mainly exported to Western countries, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Europe and the United States provided a huge market for Hong Kong as their people were richer. Besides, Hong Kong faced less competition from neighboring countries. 3. Social development. Between 1950 and 1999, Hong Kong's population sharply increased. The government thus carried out more housing and education policies. The rise in levels of education helped promote the development of Hong Kong. A. Development of housing. 1. Establishing the Hong Kong Housing Society, 1948. In 1948, the Hong Kong Housing Society was founded to provide public housing. In 1953, the government revised the housing policy and built different types of public housing. 2. Government Low-Cost Housing Program, 1961. In 1961, the Government Low-Cost Housing Program was announced to provide low-cost housing for people on low incomes. 15% of the flats would be allocated to low-income civil servants. Look at the source 12.30. Stepping into the 1950s, the government allowed people to build wooden houses or boat houses in designated areas. The aim was to solve the problem of housing shortage. The living conditions in these squatted areas were very poor. These areas also often caught fire. History in depth. Shek Kip Mei Fire and the Housing Program. On December 25, 1953, a fire broke out in the squatter areas in Shek Kip Mei. Over 50,000 people were made homeless. The government then built a resettlement estate near the fire-stricken area to house the fire victims. However, the living environment was very crowded. Residents also had to share water taps, toilets, and bathrooms. Later, the government built low-cost housing estates for lower and middle-income families. The flats had separate toilets and kitchens. The living environment was better. Look at the source 12.31. Shek Kip Mei Estate was the first public estate in Hong Kong. Today, only Block 41, Mei Ho House, listed as the Great Second Historic Building, has been preserved. 3. 10-Year Housing Program, 1972. In 1972, Governor MacLeod House announced the 10-year housing program aiming to provide public housing flats for 1 million people. In 1973, the Hong Kong Housing Authority was formed to carry out the program and manage public housing estates. 4. Home Ownership Scheme, 1978. In 1978, the Housing Authority launched the Home Ownership Scheme to help people buy public housing flats at a discounted price. 5. Home Purchase Loan Scheme, 1988. In 1988, the Home Purchase Loan Scheme was introduced to help lower and middle-income families buy flats in the private market. Public housing tenants could also apply for loans to purchase the home ownership scheme flats. 6. Adjusting Housing Policy and Strategy, 1990s. In 1994, the government set up a new housing branch. It formulated politics about private and public housing. In 1998, the government introduced the Tenants' Purchase Scheme. It allowed tenants in public estates to buy their flats and many become flat owners. Look at the source 12.32. Governor Macleay House above and Oiman Estate below. It was completed in 1975 and was one of the housing estates which he frequently visited. B. Development of education. 1. Expanding primary education. From 1950s to 1960s. By the 1950s, many children reached school age. Therefore, the government expanded primary education. It also established more teacher training colleges to ensure the qualifications of teachers. 2. Introducing compulsory education and providing technical training, 1970s. In 1971, the Hong Kong government introduced 6-year free and compulsory primary education. In 1978, the period was extended to 9 years, making junior secondary education popular. As Hong Kong's manufacturing industry changed to be technology-intensive from the early 1970s, the government started to set up technical schools. In 1975, the Clothing Industry Training Authority was set up. It worked to provide training courses for the clothing and textile industry. 3. Expanding post-secondary education from 1980s to 1990s. In the 1980s, Hong Kong's financial industry were flourishing. This raised demands for a highly educated new generation. The government thus expanded post-secondary education. It established higher education institutions, opened professional courses, and increased the number of university places. Look at the source 12.33. Information about post-secondary education in Hong Kong between the 1980s and 1990s. In the mid-1980s, Hong Kong's post-secondary education enrollment rate was still below 8%. In 1989, Governor Wilson planned to increase the enrollment rate to 18% and provide about 15,000 first-year degree places in the academic year of 1994 to 1995. 4. Development of governance and political institutions. In the early 1960s, the Hong Kong government lacked communication with the locals. As two riots broke out in 1966 and 1967, it carried out reforms to maintain social stability. A. In the 1960s, strengthening communication. Since the 1960s, the Hong Kong government strengthened local administration and consultation. The aim was to promote direct communication between the government and the people. 1. Establishing the office of the unofficial members of the Executive and Legislative Councils. In 1963, the office of the unofficial members of the Executive and Legislative Councils was set up. It was to strengthen the communication between unofficial members of the two councils and the public. It also strengthened the role of the unofficial members in monitoring the government. 2. Establishing the City District Office and the Home Affairs Department. In 1968, 10 City District offices were set up. They worked to explain government policies and gather public opinions. In 1981, the Home Affairs Department was established to lead the district offices throughout Hong Kong. It was responsible for the consultation and implementation of government policy. Look at the source 12.34. Logo of the present-day Home Affairs Department above, and a District Office Public Inquiry Service Center below. 3. Establishing various advisory bodies. Since the 1960s, the government set up various advisory bodies to collect views from the public or members of related industries. It allowed the government to formulate more suitable policies. Many Chinese elites and the middle class could also participate in public affairs through joining these advisory bodies. B. In the 1970s, combating corruption and localizing civil service. 1. Establishing the Independent Commission Against Corruption. Between the 1960s and 1970s, corruption became a major social problem in Hong Kong. It was particularly serious among the police force. Under the Prevention of Bribery Ordinance passed in 1971, a civil servant who possessed unexplained property was guilty. To combat corruption, the Independent Commission Against Corruption was set up in 1974. It was directly responsible to the governor. History in depth. Godber and the establishment of the ICAC. In April 1973, Peter Godber, a senior police officer, was suspected of corruption. He was under investigation but successfully fled Hong Kong and escaped to Britain. Godber's escape triggered huge public resentment. Students launched a mass rally in Victoria Park. They protested against the government's failure to tackle the corruption problem. Citizens also held a protest with the slogan, "Fight Corruption, Arrest Godber." As a result, Governor Muckley Hose agreed to establish anti-corruption organization. In 1974, the ICAC was founded. Look at the source 12.35. In August 1973, people started the protest against corruption, below. In January 1975, Godber was extradited from Britain to stand trial, above. He was sentenced for 4 years of imprisonment. 2. Strengthening civil service localization. The Hong Kong government started to localize the civil service after the Second World War. In the 1970s, it further opened secretary posts to local Chinese. In 1983, 49% of directorate posts were filled by local Chinese. C. In the 1980s, developing representative government. Representative government is a form of government where people take part in government affairs through their elected representatives. Before 1997, the Hong Kong government consisted of 3 elected tiers. District boards. The first direct election by election districts was held in 1982. People who were 21-year-old, later 18-year-old or above, and had lived in Hong Kong for 7 years or more had the right to vote. In 1994, the appointed seats were abolished. Urban Council and Regional Council. The first direct election by election districts took place in 1983. The qualifications for electors were the same as those of the district boards. Legislative Council. Indirect election was introduced in 1985 and direct election took place in 1991. The number of elected seats exceeded that of the appointed seats. Look at the source 12.36, a diagram of the 3-tier representative government in Hong Kong. Legislative Council. At the central level. Reviewing bills and managing public finance. Urban Council and Regional Council. At the municipal level. Providing public health services and leisure and cultural activities. District boards. At the district level. Advising on policies implemented within the district. 5. Economic and cultural links between Hong Kong and the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Hong Kong's economic and cultural links with the world continued to grow. They interacted with each other and developed bilateral relations. A. Economic aspect. 1. Hong Kong exported industrial products. From the 1950s to the 1970s, Hong Kong's industrial products increased greatly and were mainly export-oriented. Hong Kong exported cheap but good quality products such as toys, clocks and watches, textile and plastic products. They were very popular among overseas buyers. 2. Hong Kong linked with the global transportation network. Hong Kong has excellent container terminals. It is well connected to the mainland via roads and railways. It also has a modern airport with flights to and from cities around the world. As a transportation hub in the Asia-Pacific region, a lot of goods are re-exported to other countries via Hong Kong. In the 1990s, Hong Kong's Kai Tak International Airport was one of the busiest cargo airports in the world. Look at the source 12.37. The newly built Air Traffic Control Center left in 1980, and the Kai Tak Airport at the time, below. In 1996, the international air cargo throughput of the airport ranked the first in the world. 3. Hong Kong set up overseas offices and joined overseas organizations. Set up overseas offices. Between 1980 and 1990, Hong Kong founded the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices overseas to promote local products and establish closer bilateral trade relations with related countries. Joined regional and international organizations. In 1991, Hong Kong became a member of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. In 1995, Hong Kong became one of the founding members of the World Trade Organization. 4. Enterprises expanded their business in Hong Kong. Listen and cite for expansion. Many overseas enterprises set up branches and were listed in Hong Kong. Some multinational corporations even set up their headquarters in Hong Kong. By the end of the 1990s, Hong Kong had the largest number of overseas companies and headquarters of multinational corporations in the Asia-Pacific region. Held exhibitions to promote business. Since the late 1970s, many overseas companies came to Hong Kong and participated in the international exhibitions. When the Hong Kong Convention and Exhibition Center was built in 1988, they held exhibitions in the city more frequently to promote business. Look at the source 12.38. A photo showing leaders of APEC's member economies in 1997, including then the President of China, Jiang Zemin, fourth from the left, and Hong Kong Chief Executive Tung Chee-hwa, fifth from the left. B. Cultural aspect. 1. Hong Kong held international cultural events. Since the 1970s, Hong Kong regularly held international cultural events to strengthen cultural and art exchanges with the international community. Hong Kong Art Festival. Launched in 1973, the festival invites local and international artists to perform in February and March each year. It enables Hong Kong people to know more about foreign cultures. Hong Kong International Film Festival. Launched in 1977, the festival showcases Hong Kong and international films and holds seminars. This enhances cultural exchanges between the locals and foreigners. 2. Cultural organizations were founded in Hong Kong. Many non-governmental cultural organizations in Hong Kong, such as the British Council 1948 and the Japan Society of Hong Kong 1962, organized language courses and various cultural events. They strengthened the cultural exchanges between Hong Kong and related countries. Look at the source 12.39. The Hong Kong City Hall below was the venue for the first HKAF. At that time, one of the performances was Japanese classical dance above. History extended. Development of popular culture in post-Second World War Hong Kong. Introduction. Popular culture refers to cultural activities or commercial products enjoyed by the majority of people in a society in a particular period of time. As an international city, Hong Kong had absorbed cultures from different places. Moreover, its economic development enabled people to have more time for entertainment. As a result, Hong Kong culture became diverse. Films. In the early stage of the post-war period, film producers from the mainland brought their skills along to Hong Kong. From the 1950s to 1970s, more film companies were set up. They mainly made Cantonese films, and kung fu movies and comedies were the most popular. Their films covered a wide range of genres and were sold in overseas markets. Since the 1980s, Hong Kong became an important production and distribution center for Chinese films. Television. Rediffusion Television, set up in 1957, was Hong Kong's first television station. However, at the time, TV sets were expensive and people had to pay a monthly fee for the TV programs. In 1967, Television Broadcast Limited was set up to provide free TV broadcasting services. Look at the source 12.40. Kung fu movies of Bruce Lee and comedies of the Hui brothers were very popular in the 1970s. Look at the source 12.41. people watching television in public places in the late 1950s. At the beginning, only English programs dubbed into Cantonese were broadcast on TV during prime time. Since the 1970s, local programs including dramas and variety shows were broadcast. In addition, as TV sets became affordable, watching TV became increasingly popular in Hong Kong. Pop songs. Pop song refers to songs that are particularly popular in a period. Mandarin songs were the mainstreams in the 1950s and 1960s. When Western pop songs were introduced, they went viral in the city. Local music groups even imitated Western music bands. In the mid-1970s, Cantonese movie and TV theme songs became the mainstream. English, Japanese, and Korean songs were also popular. From the 1980s, local musicians tended to adopt the music of popular foreign songs and add in Chinese lyrics. This helped diversify Cantopop music. Comic books. For more than a decade after the war, Hong Kong comics were mainly influenced by Chinese comics. In the 1960s, Hong Kong nurtured a group of local comic books artists and comic strips became popular. In the 1970s, Hong Kong comic book artists developed a unique style combining heroic themes of European and American comics and characters of Japanese comics with the unique kung fu elements of Hong Kong. It successfully attracted a large number of adult readers. The development of Hong Kong's comics industry became more diversified since the 1990s. Look at the source 12.42, an album of famous American singer Presley. The post-Second World War younger generation of Hong Kong was affected by Western culture and had a liking for English songs. Look at the source 12.43, Chinese editions of Japanese comic books in the 1990s. Some classic characters are still well known today. D. Hong Kong's return to the motherland. Guiding question. What was the course of Hong Kong's return to the motherland? 1. Background. Origin of the question of Hong Kong's future. In the 19th century, Britain gained control of Hong Kong from China. As the lease of the new territories was to expire in 1997, Britain and China eventually negotiated on the future of Hong Kong. 2. Question of Hong Kong's future being put forward. In 1979, Hong Kong Governor Mak Li-hos visited China and put forward the question of Hong Kong's future. Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping stressed that China was going to recover Hong Kong, including Hong Kong Island, Kowloon, and the new territories, at a suitable time. 3. Sino-British talks about the future of Hong Kong. In September 1982, British Prime Minister Thatcher visited China. Deng Xiaoping informed her that China has decided to recover Hong Kong in 1997 and put forward the idea of one country, two systems. Sino-British talks about the future of Hong Kong began. In 1983, Sino-British talks reached a deadlock. The exchange rate of the Hong Kong dollar and stock prices dropped drastically. In October, the Hong Kong government implemented the linked exchange rate system to peg the Hong Kong dollar with the US dollar. It stabilized the Hong Kong dollar. Signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. After 2 years of negotiations, Britain and China reached an agreement over the future of Hong Kong. In December 1984, British and Chinese representatives signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. According to it, China would resume the exercise of sovereignty over Hong Kong on July 1, 1997, and Hong Kong would become a special administrative region of China. 1. March 29, 1979. Deng Xiaoping met with Hong Kong Governor Mak Li-hos and stated clearly that Hong Kong was part of China. 2. September 22-24, 1982. Deng Xiaoping told British Prime Minister Thatcher about China's decision to recover Hong Kong in 1997. After that, Sino-British negotiations on the future of Hong Kong officially started. 3. December 19, 1984. China and Britain signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration in Beijing. It was agreed that China would resume the exercise of its sovereignty over Hong Kong on July 1, 1997. 5. Drafting of the Basic Law and its promulgation. The Basic Law Drafting Committee and the Basic Law Consultative Committee were established in 1985. The former was responsible for drafting the Basic Law, while the latter conducted public consultations. The Basic Law, written according to the principle of one country, two systems, was proclaimed on April 4, 1990 and became effective on July 1, 1997. It states that Hong Kong enjoys a high degree of autonomy. The capitalist system and way of life in Hong Kong shall remain unchanged for 50 years. 6. Establishment of Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. At midnight on July 1, 1997, the British government restored Hong Kong to China. After that, the ceremony establishing the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region was held. Tung Chee-hwa was sworn in as the first chief executive. Look at the source 12.44. The Basic Law, enacted by the Central People's Government, regulates the relationship between the central authorities and the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. The Central People's Government shall be responsible for the national defense and foreign relations relating to the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. It also grants executive, legislative, and independent judicial power, including that of final adjudication, to the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Look at the source 12.45. The handover ceremony of Hong Kong left and Tung Chee-hwa sworn in as the first chief executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Right. Concept consolidation. Pre-Second World War Hong Kong. Pre-Second World War economic development. Entrepôt-trade. Industries and department stores retailing. Rise of Chinese companies. Rise of Chinese and their roles in pre-Second War Hong Kong. Political aspect. Serving as a bridge of communication between government and people. Economic aspect. Providing banking services. Social aspect. Promoting steady development. Life under Japanese occupation. Japan occupied Hong Kong in 1941 in December. Politics and administration. Establishing military government, adopting district administration, and the policy of using the Chinese to control the Chinese. Economic conditions. Serious inflation, stagnant commerce and industry. Social and cultural conditions. Shortage of food, drastic decrease in population, Japanese life and education. The end of Japanese occupation was in August 1945. Transformation of post-Second World War Hong Kong. Economic and cultural links between Hong Kong and the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Economic aspect. Hong Kong exported industrial products. Hong Kong linked with a global transportation network. Hong Kong set up overseas offices and joined overseas organizations. Enterprises expanded their business in Hong Kong. Cultural aspect. Hong Kong held international cultural events. Cultural organizations were founded in Hong Kong. Development in various aspects. Economic development. External and internal factors that favored economic development. From an entrepôt to an industrial center from 1950s to 1970s. From an industrial center to an international financial center from 1970s to the present. Social development. Development of housing. Continuous development of public housing. Development of education. Free education and the development of post-secondary education. Development of governance and political institutions. In the 1960s, strengthening communication between government and people. In the 1970s, combating corruption and localizing the civil service. In the 1980s, developing representative government. Hong Kong's return to the motherland. Question of Hong Kong's future being put forward, 1979. Signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, 1984. Drafting of the Basic Law and its promulgation, from 1985 to 1990. Establishment of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, 1997. A global outlook. Look at the timeline of events. 1900s. Sincere department store opened in Hong Kong. 1926. Heung Kee Cook established. Zhou Shuzhong appointed as the first Chinese unofficial member of the Executive Council. 1931. Tong Hua Group of Hospitals established in Hong Kong. 1937. Japan started full invasion of China. Mainland China staged a total war of resistance against Japan. 1940. Vitasoy International Holdings Limited launched in Hong Kong. 1941. Japan invaded Hong Kong. Japanese occupation of Hong Kong began. 1945. Japan surrendered. Japanese occupation of Hong Kong ended. 1948. Hong Kong Housing Society established. 1949. Founding of the People's Republic of China. 1968. City District Office scheme implemented in Hong Kong. 1971. Free and compulsory education implemented. 1972. 10-year housing program introduced. 1974. The ICAC established in Hong Kong. 1978. Home ownership scheme introduced in Hong Kong. 1984. The Sino-British Joint Declaration signed in China. 1990. Promulgation of the Basic Law in China and Hong Kong. 1991. First direct election of the Legislative Council held. Became a member of the PECC and APEC. 1995. Became a founding member of the WTO. 1997. Return of Hong Kong to the motherland. The Hong Kong Special Administrative Region established. The Four Little Dragons of Asia. In the 1960s to 1980s, Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan in Asia actively developed labor-intensive industries. They experienced economic booms and were called the Four Little Dragons of Asia. By the late 20th century, the Four Little Dragons had experienced economic transformations. Hong Kong and Singapore became international financial and trading centers, while South Korea and Taiwan were well known for their electronic industries.